Hi, people, and welcome, and thank you for tuning into our Bettery Hub channel. And as I always say, Thursdays are one of those nights that I'm always looking forward for. Thank you to join us today. And Bettery Connections program, your weekly dose of transformative business ideas and solutions, where we bring you business leaders, industry experts who are making the difference and the impact in their respective industries locally and globally. Right. So now, of course, for those of you who are with us today, just take note that we actually have our Bettery Hub channel live on YouTube channel right now, streamed live, and as well as our Facebook and LinkedIn. So if you are with us, do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, like our Facebook or LinkedIn page as well. And of course, you can also expect the whole live chat to be on Spotify as a podcast. Usually about 3 days after this live telecast or live podcast. So do join us and stay tuned to engage our speaker. We have an awesome speaker today. So definitely ask questions, engage her. Now, a bit on our guest today. Now, we are delighted to have Siddika Jaffer on Bettery Connections live from UK, and I'm excited. I've been a lot of sessions with her, chatting with her what she's going to share and everything. And awesome person. I've been learning so much from her. Now, she's going to share on scaling a cross-border startup. Now, Siddika leads a venture development at Boston Consultancy Group Digital Venture, working with the world's most influential companies to invent, invest, and build startups. Now, she's also the CEO of Enfoundery, acting as an advisor to startups to accelerate growth and facilitating investments, collaboration with VCs and angel investors. Now, she previously founded and ran an award-winning startup. Now, I'm definitely going to touch on this, right? Award-winning startup noted by Forbes as one of the top 5 startups in its space, and is recognized as one of the top 500 global business leaders in the Islamic economy. So, Siddika has a background in corporate and growth strategy as well, working with several blue chips, and is also qualified mediator sitting in the Supreme Court of Singapore. Now, I can go on and on about Siddika. So what I'm going to do is that without any delays, let's bring on Siddika for our show. Hi, Siddika.
Hi, Sakti. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Oh, I think it's an awesome, CV that you have there. Amazingly awesome. And as what I told the viewers, Siddika, I have a lot of questions on your award-winning company later as we go on. How have you been?
Good. Yeah, the sun is shining in England, so happy days.
All right. And thank you so much, Siddika, to join us amidst your busy schedule. We really appreciate, for you to just say okay the moment we call you up on our show. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. And for all our viewers out here, do feel free to engage Siddika with your questions along the way. Anything you want to say hi, you want to ask questions, and when your questions are being answered, just give us a thumbs up. Just keep communicating with us and engaging us. I think that makes the live chat much more interesting. So let's move on. So Siddika, a brief introduction of yourself and your journey behind your current success.
I'm not sure I can add too much more to what you've said, but let me just start with kind of saying I always knew, like from a young age, that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And sort of when I graduated, I was kind of thinking, right, which direction do I go in? Do I launch my first business, or do I go and work with other companies and kind of learn from their successes and failures? So I actually started out my career in consulting. Working with CEOs and C-suite of large companies to figure out what made them tick, what works, what doesn't work. And then kind of a few years in, sort of decided, okay, I think I've got enough learnings now to go out there and kind of launch my own thing. And interestingly, a lot of the learnings that I had from a corporate world just didn't apply. So I kind of put them to the side and had to relearn what it actually meant to run a tech startup. So it's been an interesting journey, and I continue to yo-yo between helping large corporates as well as kind of doing 0 to 1 myself and with other startups as well.
Right, nice. And yeah, we have Effie. Hi, Effie. Thank you to join us and give us a hi, Effie. Thank you so much. And Siddika, about your early days as a startup founder, right? Now, I did mention that your startup company was actually an award-winning startup. So maybe you want to talk more about that, the award. What was your journey like? What's the process like?
So any startup journey is like a bit of a roller coaster, right? And I think, you know, I need to be careful here not to glamorize the awards and the accolades that come along, because I think a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs think that it's all glitz and glam. And it's actually not, right? It's a really hard grind. There's lots of painful moments, but obviously lots of highs as well. And I, you know, in terms of what led to the success of the startup, I think three things: like an awesome team, timing, and making sure that, you know, I had access to a market that was really hot and growing at that time. And I think those three factors contributed to the right ingredients, along with execution, to help us win and you know, get the awards and the recognition that we did. Did we end up a unicorn? No, of course not. But nonetheless, some small successes to still be proud of.
Yeah, and I guess these are the successes that reaffirms that, you know, you are on the right track, and there are some processes in place that and I believe right now those are the processes that you are talking to the other startup owners and sharing your experiences, right? So, you know, after spending many successful years in the corporate world, you know, what inspired you to be an entrepreneur today? Because I believe that you are still an entrepreneur, engaging startups.
Yeah, I mean, I think since, you know, there's always this age-old debate about, are you born an entrepreneur, or is this something that you learn and cultivate along the way? And I'm really mixed about that. I kind of feel like from a young age, I always used to look at things, whether it was products or, you know, services, whatever it was, and think of a better way to do that. So I remember being really young, like maybe 6 years old, and thinking to myself, wouldn't it be great if there was actually a pencil that you could talk to that would write for you, right? Obviously, the pain of copying out long essays, and so on. And, you know, lo and behold, like, you know, 20 years later, those things now exist. So I think from a young age, I've always had this perspective of looking at the world and not accepting the status quo, and saying there's a better way, there's a way that we can challenge. But to your question about, you know, why did I go to corporate? Well, I think corporate, you know, we kind of make them out to be like these evil monsters, particularly in the startup world, right? But they do actually create a lot of impact. So if you do want to have impact on the world on a large scale, actually corporates are a good place to do that from. You know, you can literally be in every single household. And so that is a great platform for you to go and actually influence and learn from. But also at that scale, you know, you require a different level of operating and mindset. And so what I wanted to do was make sure that my education, whether it was lived or learned, allowed me to see what it's like to actually launch your own business, and then what does it take to scale, and what are the factors that you need to have in place as you grow along that journey. And so that's why I continue to kind of, you know, learn. It's a lifelong journey, and I go between the different stages.
Right. And Siddika, you know, a question that I would like to, you know, ask as you were sharing, right? Entrepreneurship itself, is it something that you know, you look into since you were young? You know, is it been something that's been within you that, you know, I want to start up a company by myself? You know, I want to become an entrepreneur. Was this something that was ingrained into you since young, or it just happened to be that, you know, you realized that maybe I want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, like, so my draw to it wasn't like I want to be my own boss, I want to create my own company. That wasn't it at all. My fixation is always about problems that I think need to be solved. And if I can't find a solution out there, I'm like, well, let me just go and fix it, you know? And that's really, I sort of just jump without knowing what I'm getting into, without worrying about all the different pieces. And just jump headlong into it. So I think there is this risk-taking part of my DNA that allows me to just go, hang on, that's a problem that needs to be solved. Why isn't there a good solution out there? And just jump into it.
Right. Nice. And let's talk about startups itself. You know, what is the definition of a startup company? Because we hear this word startup very often, right? So maybe hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the definition of a startup is that you are scaling or growing super fast in comparison to a small business, right? And I think that's a really important distinction to make. That you know, along with the glitz and glamour of startups, I get lots of people who want to maybe set up a food stall, and they call it, oh, I'm in a food startup. And no, you're not. You're running a food stall, and it's a small business, right? And obviously, you know, entrepreneurs can be both kinds, right? Ones that run small businesses, medium businesses, as well as ones that run startups. But I do think you need to be mindful of that distinction around the pressure of growth and scale that is involved in startups. And inevitably now, it tends to be an element of tech with that too.
All right. And so in this case, I think I like the way you describe, right? When you have a food business, it's a small food business, and there's a very big distinction between them and a startup. So are we talking about any companies that it's a startup when we are talking about the magnitude of how they actually grow their business or their potential to grow? And this is where you say that they are actually more of a labeled or defined as startups?
Yeah, and I think the other component around that is the tech element, because that is your instrument to helping you scale, essentially, right? Which doesn't mean you're excluding a physical channel as well, or omni-channel as is the new buzzword, right? Where you have physical and digital capabilities, but the tech is an essential component of a fast-growing startup.
Right. And now let's talk about the startup founders. Now, how can startup founders prepare themselves for their business journey?
I think you have to kind of do a self-evaluation, first of all, about whether you actually have the right personality and skill sets to go into a startup, right? And it's an honest conversation that you need to have with other startup founders. It's the best place to go to kind of say, what has their journey been like? And what did they find in terms of what were the key skills that were needed at each stage, right? And when you don't have those skills, that doesn't mean it's game over. It just means you need to go and build a team around you that can complement you, right? So for example, if you're launching a tech startup and you don't have a software engineering background, pretty early on, that you need to find a co-founder that you can trust and who is as dedicated to the mission and the purpose as you are, to help to join you in your startup. And that was my situation, right? I don't have a software engineering background. And so it's a bit of a handicap, I admit, but then I did bring a lot of other sides, a lot of other qualities. And yeah, so I think my team complemented itself really, really well, because we all had a mix of skill sets and were all ultimately committed to the passion and the purpose of the venture. I think without that, it's really, really tough.
But from your experience, have you had any startup companies that, like what you just mentioned, right? They start up and then, they are missing a certain expertise within that company's industry itself. And, have you met such startup owners, and then, how were they able to like... Oh, okay.
Time, right? It's very unusual to have one person who can say that they're great at everything, particularly as you start to grow and scale. So yes, maybe at idea stage, you might be a solo founder. Pretty much the second you know that you have something that is actually worth building, you kind of need to start growing your team around you. So yeah, I'd say 100% of the time, you need to build a team, and you don't have all the skills and capabilities yourself.
Right. So and from your experience, what are some factors that contribute to the success of a startup?
This is a tough question, because I think in the early stages, it's very much about team, right? And when you speak to VC investors, there's three kind of golden rules. One is the market big enough, right? Do consumers love the product, no matter how bad and embarrassing it is in its first version? And then thirdly, the team and the execution capability. And there's a lot of debate about the priority of those three things. But I would say a lot of times in the early days, VCs would say that the team is the most important ingredient, followed by the market. And then if the consumers don't love the product, yes, it's a lot of work to try and fix that in quite short order. But that feels like almost a fixable problem versus the market and the team. If you don't have the right team, you're not going anywhere.
Right. And, working with startups, what are some common mistakes that they should avoid?
Okay, so one, I think lying to yourself about the size of the market is one that I come across all the time, right? So on the one hand, you want to kind of pitch for investment, and so therefore you need to make the market look big and sexy so that, investors kind of feel like there is potential. But if along the course of that journey, you start to lie to yourself about the actual size of the market, that's a big problem. And the other thing is, I really don't think startup founders do enough research around product market fit. And so this whole product market fit conversation could be like a whole nother show by itself, right? But I think being honest with yourself about whether you've actually found product market fit and then keeping that product market fit is probably the most important thing that a startup founder needs to do. And so in the early days, what you naturally do is you tell your friends, you tell your family, and it's almost like organic, right? And so what you get in terms of initial feedback almost could be ignored because they are people that you sort of interact with who are trying to be maybe nice to you, but also are sort of moving in the same circles. They're not necessarily the target market. And so you need to be crystal clear about what is the target market and look at metrics to demonstrate whether you're really hitting product market fit or not. And also product market fit isn't a one-time utopia. Like once you get there, you've got to keep making sure that you have that fit because the market conditions keep evolving, right? Your consumers keep evolving and new products keep coming onto the market. So retaining that is super tricky. And just to add a statistic to it, 40% of startups that fail because they haven't found product market fit. So that is by far the biggest factor. And then after that, a whole bunch of them fail because they couldn't get funding or they ran out of funding.
Right. And Siddika, are there any specific examples you have where you met startup founders who are making such mistakes? And is there any way you can share with us how you actually help them in terms of guiding them through out of this?
I mean, I work with a lot of early stage startups, right? So, yeah, I mean, you could say that we have lots of painful conversations. In fact, I was just talking to a startup founder yesterday, and he initially came to me with an idea for basically virtual glasses, kind of like Warby Parker type scenario, but also combining it with services, right? And I think he was onto a good idea, but it's just, if he compared himself to the incumbents that were already in the market and the size and scale of the problem, right? Because how often do people change their glasses? It's like maybe once a year, maybe once in 2 years, and so on. We soon came to realize that the economics just wouldn't work out, right? So it's not like it's a bad idea. There are problems in there, needs to be fixed. But is the problem really big enough to motivate people to do something about it? And so, yeah, unfortunately, after like a year and a half of him trying and pivoting and doing lots of different things, he called it a day, but is now on to his second startup, which I think is super exciting and actually has a fantastic market. So it's like a constant learning journey, you know. And in my own startup as well, along the way, we made mistakes and we figured out we had to pivot as well. So like I say, it's not like this utopia thing. There's always things that you need to consider to make sure that you continue to grow.
Right. And since we are talking about startups, before we move on to the cross-border startup, now Siddika, can you just share with us one specific mistake that you had done as a startup founder and how you pivoted and actually looked into that to rectify that mistake?
So I'll share with you two stories, right? I'll share with you a moment that was probably my lowest moment as a startup founder. And secondly, the thing that caused me the most pain and was the biggest mistake that I personally made, right, as the founder. I think the first thing was, as I said before, right, I don't have a software engineering background. So I knew pretty early on that I needed to get a co-founder who was a CTO, who could act as a CTO. And I think in the early days, I sort of trusted people to come on board into that CTO founder role without truly testing how passionate and committed they were to this, to the problem I was trying to solve, right? And so I basically ran through 2 different CTOs and before landing on my third CTO, who was absolutely awesome. Right? And the difficulty was I was trying to look at my local markets. I was actually in Singapore at the time and trying to find people that I could work with locally. And I prioritized that over and above the commitment to the cause. My actual CTO, who ended up kind of building and sort of staying on the journey with me, was actually in Seattle. So you can imagine the time difference. and how we made that work. And I never, in fact, didn't actually meet him physically for 6 months after we started working together. But the reason it worked was because he was just as committed to the cause and the problem that we were trying to solve. So massive mistake. Don't take the first CTO that comes along, even if it looks like they've got a super impressive background, like being at amazing startups like Shazam, or worked at massive corporates and have a huge amount of experience. Experience is one thing, but I think it should not be viewed in isolation from passion to the problem that you're trying to solve. So that was my one mistake. And my lowest point, I remember we were about to sort of set out on our funding campaign, and I'd basically put in a bunch of money. We were running out of money really, really fast, and it was like, okay, this is make or break, right? Like, if we don't get funding in the next month, I really don't know how I'm going to keep all these people and continue to develop this product. And we were about to embark on actually a crowdfunding campaign, and we needed to put together a professional video. And so the cost of this video was like £3,000. I'm like, where am I going to get £3,000 from? Like, I'd literally put all of my savings to develop the product and get the customers I had. And I was like, okay, this is it. Like, I just can't do this anymore. And I had a wave, and I thought, okay, I've been on lots of holidays and just kept the foreign currency in different handbags. And so I spent a week going through all my different handbags, finding all the different currency notes and converting them into pounds at a really bad exchange rate, I have to say, but scraped together enough to actually pay for that crowdfunding video. And we massively overfunded. Like, within a week, we were, oversubscribed. We hit our funding target. But that was a pivotal moment. Like, it was my lowest moment, but also a week later, you're like euphoria because we smashed our targets.
And I guess this experience you had, going through your handbags to collect all your different currency notes will always stick with you, right?
Exactly. It's a moment I'm never going to forget, right? It's like a really humbling experience when you're like rock bottom, no one to help you. How are you going to get out of this mess, So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the only reason why I like to always ask, startup founders and entrepreneurs, that moment of experience, because they always have some kind of experience like what you just shared that's very close to their heart. And, and
so,
right.
Hiding money in different parts of the house for a rainy day.
and you will never know when you need it, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Siddika. I think thank you so much, to share, especially your painful moments, as a startup founder. I think these are things that sometimes makes a lot of difference and gives a lot of hopes, especially in today's times, for startup founders out there who are going through certain challenges that, look, there's always a way. Just be focused and, if you need funding, did what Siddika just did, go everywhere, look for it and get things done, and, things will be done. Right. So let's move on. Let's talk about scaling a cross-border setup. Now, what is a cross-border setup, Siddika?
So essentially, yeah, I mean, you can kind of think of it two ways. One is operationally, do you have a distributed team across different markets? But that's not, in my mind, the definition of a cross-border startup. So cross-border startup, in my mind, is really about when you're servicing markets outside of the market in which you initially found your company, right? So if you're in Singapore, it's about scaling to other parts of Southeast Asia, or as I did, Singapore, the UK was actually my second market. So yeah, that's essentially my definition for cross-border startup, is serving a customer in a market outside of your own.
All right. And, what are the considerations before one decides to do a cross-border startup?
Yeah, so it starts with, the all-important point that I think, goes through the whole startup journey. Like, is your market big enough, right? And for me, with Halal Dining Club, I knew that I was targeting a niche audience. So therefore, my market in Singapore wouldn't be big enough by itself, right? It might be enough to kind of get me through year one, but it certainly wasn't going to be big enough and attractive enough for a VC, particularly, to try and invest in that. And so if you have that sort of situation where you've got a niche audience, but you've got enough of that niche audience around the world to actually make your startup be successful, then you need to start thinking about additional markets. And all ambitious startups always think about scaling beyond the initial market anyway, right? It's very rare for a startup to be a single country startup, except for in the US, where you have an audience of 300 million people who are largely uniform. And most other startups have to consider market and size of market at some point. And then, like I said, it's the customer base as well. Like, how homogenous is this customer base? And can I access that? And what's the efficiency with which I can access that? So that's one consideration. The second one is actually, what is the effort and reward of scaling, that startup, right? So, for example, if you have a education platform, right, and it's in a particular language, most people kind of launch with English, let's say, but say it's not, and you want to access a really hot market, like say Indonesia, and you need to kind of localize it in terms of local language. You might also need to localize it in terms of curriculum and things like that. So lots of factors to consider in terms of the localization effort that's required to scale your startup. And then what impact does it actually have on the tech and the product itself, right, along that journey? And then the final one is operational, which is like, how are you actually going to run this? Like, do you physically need to have an office? Do you need to have people on the ground to serve that market? And how do you then go about hiring and getting the local talent? And what are the financial considerations? Because suddenly now, if you have an office in two different markets, then you've got two sets of accounting to do, two sets of regulations, and admin, which is a real pain in the early days of a startup. But also, what upside is there? Like, do you have a better tax rate? Are there better government incentives in that market? And so on. And so, for my specific case, I initially founded in Singapore, but because I wanted to get funding, I found that the UK ecosystem was actually a little bit more developed and advanced than Singapore at that time. So I relocated and made the UK my headquarters, and Singapore then became a subsidiary. But yeah, had people on the ground in both markets. And then as we scaled, we had people on the ground in other additional markets as well.
Right, nice. And what are the processes do you need to have in place to operate in a cross-border startup?
Yeah, so I think all of those four things that I talked about, I think one of the things from an operational perspective that you need to think about, as well as a commercial perspective, is the build buy partner question, right? So do you actually build this yourself in that local market? Do you buy another startup or come to some sort of arrangement, whether it's stock swaps or whatever, or some sort of reverse kind of equity situation with a startup in that market that's doing the same thing as you are, but just knows the local market really well and has a great team on the ground already? Or finally, do you partner with somebody, right? And I think a lot of people forget the partner and the buy part of the conversations because they want to maintain control and do everything themselves. So the partnership thing, particularly for us, was a key part of my strategy early on. Like, I recognized really early on, the food tech market space is super crowded, right? And so why try to reinvent and go up against, basically unicorns that are already in the market? And instead, why not partner with them, tap into their assets? Yes, I'm not going to get 100% of the pie by doing that, but I'm certainly going to get more and scale faster than if I was to try to do that alone. So I would say that framework is a super important framework to think about. And then from a technology perspective as well, there are lots of different ways that you can skin that. So for example, could you license something that allows you to white label it basically with your brand on top? And again, it's about speed to market. So we actually had lots of conversations where, as we developed, we had lots of startups coming to us and saying, could we, license your platform and your technology as well, because we've built some, amazing core tech. Yeah.
Right. And talking about all these processes, I feel on my part, it's like, wow, there are so many things to look out for. So, for a startup who's thinking about having a cross-border, startup. So, do you think, is there anyone, like, for example, if I'm in Singapore and I'm looking into maybe do a startup or cross-border startup in UK, Is there, how do I actually go about starting up with it? Do I look for somebody in UK? Is there a specific consultancy I got to approach? What's the process, or what's the next step like for me?
Yeah, so I mean, consultancies, I would say, are probably too expensive or probably far down the line, right? Depending on what stage of the startup you're actually at. So if you're an early stage startup, and I refer to early as before Series A, basically, then I think what you need to do is just figure out, is this something that I can do by myself, right? Can I hire people directly? Can I form partnerships? Or do I basically partner with someone, right? Like I just talked about. So for me, because I started in Singapore, and I felt like I had a team that was local on the market, that knew Singapore, that established a culture, so that I could actually trust them to kind of run Singapore, independently, well, semi-independently, whilst I moved to the UK, because I'm from the UK originally, so I have an understanding of the local market. I think that's the key thing. So I actually moved myself. And if it was a different situation, I would consider moving a part of your core team to that market if they already have an understanding of that local market. Because in the early days, I think it's really important to have the culture of the startup maintained. Like it's really important to have that integrity. And so having a core part of your team on the ground in that market is super important, right? Unless it's something that you feel like it can just be served without physically you needing to be there. So for example, if I'm running a fashion startup and by scaling or serving an adjacent market, it just means that I need to, have a logistics provider that I can post things through to the next market. And yeah, there's no necessary reason to have someone on the ground in the early days until you get to sufficient scale where it's actually worth that, whether it's marketing or logistics and so on. So I think it really depends on what the startup is, what is the need to have people on the ground, and how can you do that? Like, is there an agency, for example, marketing? Is there an agency that understands the local market, or is there a partnership?
All right.
But I guess the short answer to your question is, do the hard work yourself and do the research to figure out the answers to all of these questions. I wouldn't outsource that decision making to a consultancy.
All right. Thanks, Siddika. And what are the advantages of scaling a cross-border startup?
I mean, yeah, it's the market size, right? Essentially, you're now tapping into a second audience and growing your access. But, like I said, it gives you sort of revenue growth, but at the same time, it does come with operational complexity as well. So that is something that you need to be considerate of.
All right, great. Thanks, Siddika. I think a lot of information that you have shared about, the advantages of a cross-border startup. Now, I'm going to next go more specific to you. Some rapid questions about yourself, right? So, Siddika, what do you want to be remembered for?
That's a good question. I think it's changing the world in some way. I know that sounds super cliche, but really one of my big values is leaving the world better than I found it, right? Like there's a famous saying and it really resonates with me. And yeah, so what I want to be remembered for is creating impact and improving people's lives.
Right. And the legacy that you want to leave behind?
I think it's linked to that, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I am really passionate about is helping female and ethnic minority founders actually get represented, get funding, and help them achieve their entrepreneurial ambitions. And so you might ask, well, why is that? And I think one is because I've walked in the shoes of being a person of color and a female founder. And it's no secret, right, that female founders and people of color are the least likely to get funded in the startup world, right? So I think it's like less than 1% of people of color get funding in all the VC money that exists out there, which is just a ridiculous statistic. So I try to do my best to shine a light on those founders, but also help them with my time to help them navigate some of the challenges, right? And one of the biggest challenges is people not understanding the problem that you're trying to solve because they can't connect to it. So how do how do you frame it in such a way that is dispassionate, allows people to just see the opportunity in hard, cold numbers, right? And to look at it from that perspective. And the second biggest thing is navigating networks and access to capital. And so I was fortunate enough to get some funding, right? Like I said, I didn't get to unicorn status, but through the networks that I've built, I've been passionate about trying to connect promising founders to those VCs or angels that I approached myself for my own funding round. And that's really was why I created enfoundery, was to work on that. And then the second part of it is why female and ethnic minority founders. Well, I think, particularly in the cases of immigrants and things like that who are moving to new countries, oftentimes the startup venture or the business that they're setting is the only thing that they have, right? It's the only way that they can create a mechanism for them to survive. And also, sometimes they're solving massive problems that the rest of society that they're living in don't realize is a problem. So I think you get a double net effect of doing that. You're improving the life of the person that's affected, but you're also creating broader societal impact by funding those startups.
Right, great. And where do you see Siddika in 5 years?
Well, if I had all the money in the world, I think I would love to basically set up some sort of accelerator venture builder kind of platform to basically fund these entrepreneurs myself. So that's my goal, and that's what I'm trying to work towards. At the moment, I'm taking baby steps to get there by helping them with my time and helping them with connections. Eventually, I hope to have a fund so that I can be involved in funding that ecosystem myself.
Right, nice. And your biggest challenge?
I get bored very quickly. So my biggest challenge is making sure that I'm constantly focused and don't get distracted by other amazing opportunities, right? If you look at my background, I've sort of done a lot of different things, from like marketing to strategy to even law and a bit of finance. And so I like the adventure of learning and trying to do new things, but I think it's time I start focusing on a specific area. So that's my biggest personal challenge. It's like finding one thing that I can deep dive on.
Okay. And your greatest achievement?
I think my greatest achievement is actually a moment, right? So as I said, I went on this journey to try and get funding for Halal Dining Club and so on. And, the amount of discrimination I faced was unreal. Like, it really surprised me. I was not prepared for that. And I worked in quite male-dominated environments before, in sort of a consultancy background and so on. And although it's changing now, 5 years ago, it wasn't the market that it is today. So I think one of my biggest wins was after speaking to a particular VC who basically passed on the investment with me. When I launched enfoundery, they actually came to me and said, we're actually looking at this space. It looks like it's really hotting up. And, let's have a discussion. So I said to them, let's do an event together. We actually put together a room full of, I think, 100 people, of investors and of entrepreneurs that were in the same kind of market as I was. And we showcased for the first time in the UK the opportunities in that market segment. And for me, that was a really proud moment.
Right. Thanks, Siddika. And, time just runs. It's just like, wow, I just felt like we just started our live chat, and next thing, it's like 45 minutes. So, Siddika, any word of advice for our viewers out there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say whatever you do in terms of your startup journey, I think one of the lessons that I've learned is always speak to people who are at the next level or two levels beyond where you want to target, and take lessons from them, right? I think being really open-minded to feedback. I think there's an element of a lot of startup founders are quite stubborn, and they kind of, and you need that, right? You do need a bit of that. They think they're onto the next best thing since sliced bread. But learn from the lessons of mistakes other people have made, and really network and build your sort of circle of support from other startup founders. I think it's a super important thing.
Right. And Siddika, what how can interested viewers, I'm sure there are a lot of startup founders out there, or aspiring people who are talking about or thinking about cross-border startups. So how can they actually contact you if they want to have a chat with you to know more?
Yeah, LinkedIn would probably be my preference. So yeah, please do drop me a note on LinkedIn, and also just mention that you saw me on this show or part of the audience of this show, so I can respond to you in a timely fashion.
All right, cool. So take note to all of you guys there. Just go on to LinkedIn, just send a message to Siddika, and she will get back to you. All right, if you are thinking or you have any questions or you want to engage Siddika. Siddika, thank you so much. I mean, it has been an awesome session. And my biggest takeaway for today's session was always be having money in every single place in your house, because you never know when you need it. That was a big takeaway. But I appreciate so much sharing from yourself. Thank you so much, and I think it has been an awesome session.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right, thanks, Siddika. So I'll just have you the holding it in. We'll catch up soon, and I'll get back to you.
Great, thanks.
Cheers. All right, it was a great session. I think I personally enjoyed most of the information that Siddika was sharing. I think experience, especially a personal experience as a startup founder, and expertise in terms of what you got to look out for, the advantage of cross-border startups. I think it was awesome. So for those of you guys who are seriously thinking about how do you go about having a cross-border startup, do feel free to engage Siddika. And now we have come to the end of our today's live chat. So for those of you out there, thank you so much, because no live chat is complete without you. So thank you for spending your time with us on a Thursday evening. And of course, please do leave your comments or your feedback so we can consistently do it better just for you. Now, just a reminder once again, if you're watching us on live chats on Bettery Lab YouTube channel, do remember to subscribe to our page and tune into our Bettery Hub podcast on Spotify, which will be uploaded latest by Friday. Now, so remember, do take action and keep doing it better. And remember to stay safe. Till next week, see ya.